In the last video, we talked about the idea of revelation. And revelation is the idea that to know God and to know the ways of God and to know the will of God, and even therefore to know the ultimate purposes of human life and what the life well lived looks like, well, God will simply have to reveal these things to us. So all of those big questions that we ask around the dorm room, hallway, when you're a freshman in college maybe, all those big questions about God's existence and the meaning of our lives and perhaps what transcendent purposes we should be living for, these are all obviously massive, huge, and perennial questions. But the way of revelation is different than a few other ways that someone might try to answer those questions. So I've got a lot of content here, and I'm just going to really speed through this, I think, because I don't want this to drag on so long, but we really got to get down to what general revelation is, because a lot of people skip over it. Now, as I said, those big perennial God questions and human life questions can be answered in a variety of ways, or they can be attempted to be answered in a variety of ways. The way of revelation is different than a couple of those ways. So, what do I mean? Unlike what a rationalist might say, human reason is not enough to answer those kinds of big questions. And unlike what an empiricist might say, our experiences, our empirically guided scientific studies, let's say, even the kinds of experiences that we win through common sense, through a life well lived for many years, a lot of years of street experience, that method, that empirical method, won't be enough either. And unlike what a romantic might say that it's our gut instincts about God and religious truth, those deeply held convictions, wherever they come from, those are the way to find out those answers. But the way of revelation says that deeply held conviction, although it might be a clue here and there, it's not a reliable source to know about the big questions or the answers to the big questions either. So what are we left with, if not all those methods? Well, God will have to speak to us, and we will have to listen. The good news is that he has spoken about those questions and that he continues to speak about those questions. Now, the two broad ways of revelation through which God does seem to speak have often been called, for a long time, general revelation and special revelation, as I've mentioned. Now, what is general revelation? General revelation is the idea that God has revealed something of himself, and is revealing something of himself to everyone, to the general populace, not just to the church-going populace, not just to the Bible-reading populace, not just to the Christian populace, but to everyone. And he's going to use general means to reveal those things. General, ordinary things will do that revealing, not just profound epiphanies, not just getting lit up in the sky and seeing something that changes your mind massively because an angel has visited you. We're talking about very, sometimes, ordinary means. Well, this sounds good. So where do we go exactly to receive God's general revelation? In short, and here are a couple more handy terms, if you can handle them. I think they're handy. External testimony and internal testimony. Two sources, two channels of general revelation. And here's what I mean. External testimony means that God reveals something of himself to us in creation. The external world all around us is talking to us in this view. What does that mean? Well, when it comes to creation, it means, as we've already mentioned, looking at Psalm 19, verse 1 especially, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." Now, how does this really work? There's an old Tom Hanks movie that only about 11 people ever saw, including me, called Joe versus the Volcano. And in one scene, Joe is stranded. He's utterly alone. He's floating on a small raft. He's completely lost somewhere out in the Pacific Ocean. He hasn't had food or water for days. And in this one scene, Joe is unconscious on the raft at night, and he's seemingly near death. But slowly an enormous and brilliant moon rises up over the horizon, over the ocean, and the light of the moon is so brilliant and bright and warm that it wakes him up. And as he squints in absolute awe at the size of the moon and at its beauty, he becomes so moved that he slowly stands himself up somehow before the moon. And his lips and his tongue are dried out. But even still, he faces the heavens and he says these words, "O God, whose name I do not know, thank you for my life." The idea of the external testimony of creation is that there are moments when we have eyes to see something or someone almost on the other side of the beauty and the majesty we find in nature. Maybe it's a full moon. Maybe it's looking at Half Dome at Yosemite. Maybe it's observing the sheer power of a river in springtime after snow melt. Or maybe it's just seeing the delicate but perfectly formed wings of a butterfly. And we look at those things and we realize that this is not just mere matter, not just crude matter, to quote Yoda, that we're looking at. Not at all. It's actually someone's work. It's art. It's someone's art. A personal artist. It's not just nature, it's creation. And we're sensing something in those moments, something of the presence of a creator. And that creator is speaking to us. That's what general revelation means. John Muir, the naturalist, who was not a Christian as far as I know, but knew something of general revelation. He was one who famously explored the Sierra Nevada mountain range and whose house is actually not very far from where we live here. He had a sense of general revelation when he said these words: "The rocks and the sublime canyons, the waters and the winds and all life structures, animals and ouzels, meadows and groves, and all the silver stars are words of God, and they flow smooth and ripe from his lips." When you hear those words of God flowing toward you from creation, sometimes that moment will almost make the hair of the back of your neck stand up. Many people have a story or two in their lives about a moment of encounter where something they saw or something that happened to them made them almost want to stand in a kind of a reverence or maybe even kneel. And they're not even sure why exactly. But the right word is reverence. And they'll be prompted to say, "Thank you," not even sure who's hearing the thank you. Even if they would say they're not even sure if they believe anyone is listening to their thank you. I think for some people, this moment happens when their first child is born and they realize as they're looking into this new little face, that even if they are the biological father or mother, that face, the face that's looking up at them, is so profound that it's not really their own creation. That this child it's almost like this child comes from another place, has another maker, maybe a divine father. And so they may spontaneously say something close to, "O God, whose name I do not know, thank you. Thank you for this life." Now, I've kept saying that in general revelation, God makes something of himself known. Not everything, but something. And Tom Hanks is right in that scene. In the moon, God reveals something of himself, but he doesn't reveal his name. "O God, whose name I do not know." He doesn't reveal in the moon the way of, let's say, our utter reconciliation with God, how we could have a kind of personal closure with God. He doesn't reveal that God is not just a creator in general, but he also has existed eternally in the persons of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. That's the stuff of special revelation, which we'll get to later. But the point of this is to say, don't skip over general revelation, because God's revealing something of himself there too. Well, what is he revealing? Fair enough question. Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20 gives us some more specifics. Paul says here, "What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." So now if you take Psalm 19:1 that we've seen and Romans 1 together, general revelation tells us that there is a divine creator, that he has glory, which another way of saying that is that he has weightiness to him, that he, in other words, matters. He matters most of anything. It tells us that he has power. This creator has power and beauty, that he is artistic. It really tells us, too, that he has a care for the creation. I could cite some other texts for that show that care piece. It shows that he is eternal. And we could probably go on, because Romans chapter 1 suggests that there are these other invisible attributes, plural, that are revealed. So you could riff off this a bit. Now, I also mentioned internal testimony. All that up until now has been external testimony of God revealing himself in creation. What's internal testimony? That's just to say our conscience is a way that God speaks to us. It's been called also our sensus divinitatis. That is your one Latin term for this video. The divine sense that we all have. We may have suppressed that sense, but it's built in there somehow. And it's actually an internal testimony of God to us. He's speaking to us about himself and his ways from within us. It's pretty wild. And that means that even if you don't believe in God with your intellect, you may still have an internal sense that you probably shouldn't just count God out altogether. You're a little bit God-bothered, as I like to say. Or as often happens, you'll have perhaps you're a person that has deep convictions about right and wrong. You've got deep convictions about goodness and evil, about justice and fairness. That is your, according to the sensus divinitatis, according to conscience, that is your conscience insofar as it is calibrated to God's own moral will. He's speaking to you, something of his own moral will. This is the source of another old idea called the noble pagan idea, which is not meant to be derogatory. It just means that there are people who are, let's say, someone like Plato, who doesn't know Scripture. He wasn't even around to have encountered the scriptural form of special revelation that would give him all this specific content of God's moral commands and written will. But even still, Plato lives generally admirable life and even urges people on to what Christians would even call virtue. It's almost as if he knew the Ten Commandments somehow. Paul puts it this way in Romans 2, verses 14 and 15, where he says, "For when Gentiles, like Plato or others, other noble pagans, when these Gentiles do not have the law, but they by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." The internal testimony is God writing something of his will on our hearts. And that's another channel of this general revelation. Now, my own other favorite general revelation text, and I'm just going to put this in there because it's a gem, it's Acts chapter 17, verses 28. That's where Paul, the Apostle Paul, is speaking to a room full of Greek, very philosophical non-Christians. And Paul is ultimately trying to make a case for Jesus Christ in particular. But he begins this slow wind-up before he gets to Jesus by citing Epimenides, who was a pagan Greek poet who wrote the line, "In God we live and move and have our being." That's the quote that appears in the book of Acts. So Paul is quoting Epimenides. He's saying essentially, I'm going to build my case for Jesus Christ to you, but I'm going to start by general revelation. I'm going to start from what God revealed to one of your own ancient poets in about 600 BC, we think, who had no access to the special revelation of the Bible at all. Now, here's decided whether or not to add this in, but this is going to be, I'll call this bonus round on general revelation. So follow me here. If you're a Christian and you do know Jesus Christ and you've read the Bible, et cetera, and you've got all this stuff that we would call special revelation, and you've trusted in Jesus, here's what general revelation especially means for you. It means that you have the privilege of interpreting God's general revelation through the lens of his special revelation. And that's an incredible combination that can change the way you move through the world entirely. And here's what I mean. And this is just my example. You'll have your own maybe. And please find your own example. My example is this. If you see a great waterfall, for some reason I always go back to Yosemite because that's where I've had some of my most profound aha moments about the power of God by viewing nature. But let's say you see Nevada Falls at Yosemite. Anyone looking at Nevada Falls might say, wow, yes, in this waterfall I see a glimpse of your power and glory and majesty, O God, whose name I do not know. And that's a perfectly legitimate general revelation moment. And a lot of people probably have that moment there. But if you're a person who has heard and received the words of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, all of his teaching about the Father, the teaching about the kingdom, about the importance and the effect of his death and resurrection on our lives, all that good special revelation stuff. And if you've trusted in him, you'll now see more in that same waterfall than you would have seen otherwise. You'll get what I call the full read on the waterfall that reveals even more of God. And so you might say something like this, and just allow me to rhapsodize a little in the form of a prayer, really. You look at the waterfall and you say, Father, in the chaos of this waterfall crashing over the rocks, I'm getting a powerful reminder of your own majesty, of how you, with your Son and the Holy Spirit, brought the world into being out of that watery chaos that I read about in the book of Genesis. And my goodness, the full force and the fierceness of this water tells me something of your power, but also that you are a God who is not to be trifled with, that you are a judge, and that you elevate the humble, but you will wash away the proud at the end. But oh my goodness, even deeper, that Jesus Christ allowed himself to be crashed down upon by your breakers, by your waterfall of judgment that these falls so vividly portray. Also, I could experience your grace, Father. And to keep the rhapsody going here, in the clearness and the coolness of the water, which never stops flowing, it seems. It gives me a sense, Lord, of your cleansing grace, a visceral sense of how you washed away my guilt thoroughly. You washed away my sin and my shame. It gives me a sensory experience of that which I knew intellectually, but now I feel in my bones. It reminds me of my baptism, perhaps. It reminds me that you continue to cleanse and refresh me with yourself. This water, and this is my last one, it's living water, which just it sounds like a term of Christianese, but it just means it's flowing, it's bubbling up. The water of Nevada Falls is clearly living, and it's abundant, and it just keeps flowing and flowing. And so you, Jesus, I'm reminded, you promised to fill me with living water so that I'll never thirst again. So help me, Lord, to always slake my spiritual thirst on you and you alone, trusting that you and your grace just always keep flowing on into eternity. Well, if God continues to reveal himself in general revelation, which he does, it means that we're invited to look around us every day and see what words about himself God is speaking, and to receive those words with joy and reverence. And to do this in the most ordinary and general place. It means that we get to, even if you don't have access to Nevada Falls, it means that we get to lovingly and creatively scan our eyes across creation, even considering the humblest flower. I've got some flowers that are growing pretty impressively in our backyard on weeds. They're weeds I need to hoe up, but for a moment, they've got this really impressive little flower. Or I was also thinking of seeing a centipede, for example. It's an insect. That's yucky, maybe. But even in the humility of a centipede or a flower upon a weed, we can say, well, this is general revelation. Lord, what is it about your lordship, about perhaps your beauty, your grace, your fierceness, your determination, What of your attributes is reflected in this thing I'm looking at? That's an amazing way to live, right? It's a way to move through the world, to hear and to see that changes even the most mundane moment, potentially. I learned this way of thinking and living in light of general revelation, partly from John Calvin, that I've quoted a couple times already in this series. He was a 17th century theologian. Some people don't think about him as a great theologian of general revelation or of joy, but he was. I'm here to tell you. And so I just want to close with one of his quotes. He said, "There is not one little blade of grass, there is no color in this world that is not intended to make us rejoice."